Until you write a book, you're just unsure you would notice, Tim. Until you write one, you have no idea whether you're capable of writing one, right? It seems like it's just different from any other task you've ever done. I never thought about it in terms of having talent. It was really a question of what my level of enjoyment was. I really had found something that I loved doing. You're doing organic chemistry and you feel like you're the dumbest person in the class, you are not gonna finish that course. And if you don't finish organic chemistry, you can kiss med school goodbye, right? So go to a school where you're not in the bottom of your class. That's the advice. I cannot think of a more impossible task, right, that the world could give us than to forgive one of our children's murderers. I think that's, to my mind, that is proof of the existence of God.
First of all, this is my voice. I'm Tim Green and I have ALS. This podcast is not about ALS or living with disabilities. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for me. I am a father of 5 with a marriage that's lasted for over 33 years. I am a #1 New York Times best-selling author of 41 books, an NFL first-round pick with an 8-year career. I worked on TV for Fox Sports, Good Morning America, Court TV, and Extra. I've hosted BattleBots, A Current Affair, and Find My Family. And I am also a practicing attorney. In this podcast, we're diving into real-life stories. From triumphs to trials, we'll explore the extraordinary in the ordinary. Join me, Tim Green, and my son Troy each week for real conversations, laughter, and insights. Because life is a journey, and everyone's got a story. My voice in today's episode is powered by 11 Labs. Malcolm Gladwell, I am so excited to speak to you. We met just once before when you shredded me in a debate at New York University. You are a literary giant. You are the Stephen King of nonfiction and a modern-day Mark Twain. Even your critics begrudgingly admit your genius. Your 8 books have sold over 23 million copies in the U.S. alone, and books like The Tipping Point, Blink, and Outliers have changed the very fabric of our society. You also have your own extremely successful and captivating podcast, so thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with us today.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Your epilogue in Outliers chronicles your family's history, going back to your great-great-great-grandparents in Jamaica, which was an English colony at the time. Would you give us a summary of your heritage? But please don't leave out the Chinese shopkeeper for those who haven't read the book.
Oh, yeah. My father's English and grew up in Kent, outside of London. My mother is Jamaican. They met at the University College in London in the 50s, where they were both attending college. My mom grew up in a little tiny town, not that in the center of Jamaica, and her, in the way that is typical of Jamaica, her mother was dark. Her father was probably biracial, although it's really hard to tell in Jamaica. So it's a long, complicated family history that involves, in like I said, it's very typical of Jamaica for people to be the product of a jumble of different ethnicities. But the story about the Chinese shopkeepers. My mother and her twin sister had no particular chance of going to high school, let alone college, because at the time there was no public high school and no public colleges in Jamaica. The only way you could do that is if you got a scholarship, and they first of all got at the very last moment a scholarship to a boarding school on the other side of the island, which is how they got a high school education. And then they were stuck because there was no way. The only way to go to college was to go to either America or England. This was the 1950s. And my grandfather did not nearly have the money to do that. And the way it worked was my mother's twin sister won a scholarship. There was one scholarship awarded every year to the most promising student in Jamaica. She won that scholarship. She went to the University College and then split her scholarship in half, gave the money to my mom, And then the balance of the money was lent to my grandmother by the Chinese grocer down the road. And that's how my mom got to England and met my father. That's why I am here. I'm here because of the generosity of my aunt, the Chinese grocer, and the incredible faith of my grandparents in their children's ability to make it into a British university. So there's a lot of
That's amazing.
I'm a highly contingent person.
Which is a pretty big theme throughout Outliers, right?
Yeah.
It's never what it seems.
Your family lived in Southampton, England when you were really young. Then, at 6, your parents decided to move to Canada. Do you have any memories of England, and do you know why your parents decided to move?
We moved. My dad was a young academic, and he was offered. Canada started in the 1960s, basically its own MIT, a school called the University of Waterloo, which was supposed to be a science and technology school, an elite science and technology school. And it turns out it is. Today it is, I think, the second or third leading source um, of software engineers to Silicon Valley, the University of Waterloo. Anyway, this was in its infancy. The school had to staff up, and they hired um, young academics from around the world to come to rural Canada to start this school out in the middle of the cornfields of southern Ontario. My father was one of those lured to Canada. Um, I think he liked the idea of starting over and being able to afford a house and all the things you could do in Canada, but not in England. And so we came when I was 6. My memories of England are very fleeting. You know, you don't remember that much before you're 6. But I grew up in a very, very, very small farming town in the middle of southern Ontario, about an hour and a half from Toronto, close by to this startup university, of which it's funny, my father's fellow faculty on there, he was in the engineering department. I don't think there were any more than 2 or 3 Canadian-born professors. Everybody was just from another part of the world. Indians, uh, Africans, Europeans. It was a little United Nations in the middle of the cornfields.
Do you think it was just staffing up, or was it intentional to have the different backgrounds?
Staffing up. It was like that was Canada in the '60s. There just wasn't a lot of qualified STEM faculty to choose from. So you had to go to the rest. You had to go to the rest of the world. And my father he taught in that school for um, 40 years, and I don't think he had any more than a handful of Canadian born graduate students. They were always mostly Indians, some Africans. It was just that's just the way the school was oriented. It was it was a really remarkable place, and I spent my childhood was spent in the company of incredibly brilliant Indian mathematicians. That's my house was full of them. they they ate most of their meals, as far as I can tell, in my house.
Elmira, Ontario is a rural part of Canada, and you were in a Mennonite community. Did your family then attend a Mennonite church? And if so, how strict were the rules?
Yeah, we did. After a while, we started out. It was so the little town I grew up in was, you're right, was a Mennonite community, meaning that uh, the Mennonites they are a very small Protestant denomination, um, very similar to the Amish. There are components of it um, who drive horses and buggies and don't have electricity, and then there are other portions of the Mennonite movement which are quite modern. But the community was overwhelmingly Mennonite. We grew up in that world. Our neighbors had no electricity and uh, drove around in a horse and buggy. And uh, my high school was probably 70% Mennonites, and it was a fantastic world. Mennonites are really, really interesting group. They are uh, they are very they're on the liberal end of the evangelical movement, meaning not, I don't mean in terms of their theological position, but they are pacifists and very interested in community and ending conflict wherever they can. And we were drawn into that world. And after my parents eventually and my brother ended up joining the Mennonite Church, and my mother to this day attends a Mennonite church and felt very much at home there. It's really a remarkable. There are three areas of Mennonites in North America. There's a big group in eastern Pennsylvania, a big group in the Canadian prairies, Manitoba principally, and a big group in southern Ontario. And they are uh, enormous. They play a kind of an unusually large cultural role in Canada. They're very similar. We used to always joke that they are Jews who farm. They came from Eastern Europe almost exactly the same time as the Jewish immigration to America, 1890s through 1920s. They were persecuted in Eastern Europe the same way Jews were, and they have been disproportionately successful in the same way that Jewish immigrants have. It's just that they're farmers. They're not like small business owners and lawyers or whatever uh, professions that Jewish immigrants favored. Um, but otherwise, it's a very kind of similar phenomenon. So this was the world that I grew up in, and was you wouldn't think driving through rural Ontario that you would be in the middle of as culturally exotic a place as you are, but you are definitely in the middle of a culturally exotic place.
Indian mathematicians and Mennonites, and Jewish farmers.
We used to do a party every year. We had a very large backyard with tons of poplar trees, and we quickly realized that raking the leaves each fall would be a overwhelming task. So my dad would invite all of his graduate students to rake the leaves, and he'd throw a party afterwards. They thought this was hilarious because they were all from Nigeria and India and Pakistan. And it grew so popular that in the last year we did it before we moved, I think we had something like 20 something different nationalities represented in our backyard raking leaves. So it was it was a very strangely um, my mother was given a sari by one of my dad's graduate students, and so she would wear it to fancy, any dinner or occasion my parents went to. My mom would wear a sari. That was just the so we were, it was quite funny in retrospect. This Jamaican lady in a sari wandering around rural Canada.
That must have been fun with all the different cultures. I read that you have two brothers. What was your relationship like growing up? Where are they now, and do you stay in touch?
Yeah, I have two older brothers. I have both are retired. One was an elementary school principal in our hometown, and the other lives about an hour away and used to work in the chicken business. And I'm close to both of them, particularly my middle brother, who I see all the time. I just saw him. He's a great cook, so it's an enormous incentive on my part to go home um, and to sample his cooking. But my middle brother and I were both big runners growing up. So we spent years going to track meets together. My brother, no, you were a football player, Tim. My high school did not have a football team. Had we had a football team, my brother would have been an incredible wide receiver. He uh, was close to 6 feet, but I'm skinny. He's big, really fast. He was a national caliber quarter miler, and so insanely coordinated that my brother would pick up a sport, and within like the second time, I think the second time he played golf, he was golfing as good as his friends who'd been golfing their whole life. He picked up a tennis racket and was like beating people on the court within a week. He's that kind of person, and in fact, everything comes so easily to him that he has no incentive to work hard at any of it. But he would have been. I think about him, he would be a prototypical uh, wide receiver candidate had he ever played football. Blazing speed, a lot of bulk and strength, and just extraordinary um, coordination. Now, whether he had the discipline to run precise patterns is a question I think we'll leave to history. But but I know my brother was the great. My middle brother was the great athlete in the family, and I was a um, I stuck to running. I didn't do this is a to give you an example of how hilariously gifted my brother was. I was very diligent and would train, every day, and I would be in peak condition, and I would invite, and he would train once a week. He'd go to track practice once a week. It's the only time he'd ever run. I would invite him, and he was a sprinter. I would invite him to come and do this six mile course with me, and I would go top speed, and he would easily keep up. This is someone who never did any distance running whatsoever. So you imagine how humiliating and emotionally devastating it is to have an older brother who makes you look slow, even though he never does any work. So,
You mentioned your father being a professor at Waterloo University, but I want to expand on that. He was a professor of mathematics, which is a big deal. But I read that when you were 11, he began taking you with him to the university. Why did he do that? And what was that experience like?
well, I think he did it. I mean, I wanted to go. I would do anything to get out of school, and I think he appreciated that and quietly wanted to encourage that. My father was quite subversive, um, and I wanted to come with him because I wanted to go to the library. I wanted to go to the university. I loved libraries and reading as a kid, and so and also it was an excuse to what kid doesn't want to have what kid with two other siblings doesn't want to have a huge block of alone time with their father, right? This is some kids go fishing with their dad or camping with their dad. I went to the library with my father. I went to the university with my father, so I could go to the library. Um, and I thought the universities, I thought the university where I worked was this kind of magical place as a kid. I thought it was this incredible idea that tons and tons and tons of very, very smart, knowledgeable people would descend on a building and just kind of think all day. I just thought that was amazing. I could never get over what my father did for a living, which was he sat at a desk with a pencil and a paper, and he would just kind of, he was write out equation. He's still solving mathematical problems, but there was no other. I was used to the idea that adult jobs involved something tangible, right? Like you worked with a machine, or you interacted with people, or you did some specific thing, and he did none of that. He just sat at his desk in silence and wrote on a pad. And I just thought this is the greatest job I've ever seen. Like, and he so clearly enjoyed it. Um, so I did the idea of being around someone engaged in this magical, mysterious process was um, enormously seductive to me as a kid. So whenever possible, I would try and convince my father to let me skip school and come with him to the university. And
Well,
it was those are some of the. I've actually remembered that now that I have kids myself. I remember this. I remember my greatest memories of my preteen years are not things that happened in school. They are things that happened outside of school. So if either of my daughters want to skip school, they and come with daddy to work, they can come as much as they want because that's what they're going to remember. So I'll attempt to carry on the family tradition with my own daughters.
what would you read at the university library?
I would uh, I would wander the stacks randomly and just kind of look at books, and because there were all these books I'd never seen before. Obviously, my high school library had a tiny, tiny fraction of the books. I would read fiction. I was really into American politics. I would read tons and tons of books on American politics, history books. It was just, I just loved the idea of being around books and smelling them. I loved the smell of books. And so I would just sit there all day long and kind of randomly read things and read like, there were all these journals, magazines, all these things I'd never seen before. It was incredibly exciting.
I had a similar experience with how I viewed my dad's work because he was announcing football games when I was growing up. And I thought he just went, I knew he played in the NFL, and I thought he just went to the games and they asked him to talk. So he was doing it. I had no clue he was getting paid. And then he wrote books, obviously, and I knew he loved reading and loved writing books. So I had no clue he was getting paid for either occupation. I thought it was just things he
Yeah.
did for fun.
Yeah. That's the best lesson I think you can give your children is to make your work seem like fun. That's like a hugely beautiful thing to pass on.
What kind of books did you read as a kid?
Well, my dad read a lot of, the classic children's books to us. He read Dickens to us. He read uh, the Narnia books to us. We read the Bible every night. And then the things I read enormous amounts of, as a young man, I read enormous amounts of mystery stories, detective fiction, thrillers. And then as I got a little older and I got super interested in American politics, I had read, by the time I was 15, I knew, I had read an astonishing number of books on American politics. Um, I don't know why it fascinated me so, but I just thought that, here I was living, we were an hour from the border. So we're an hour from this huge, fascinating country, which I had never visited, um, which seemed way more exciting and complicated than the country I was living in. And I was just kind of desperately curious about what it was like. And so I would read, Hunter S. Thompson and William F. Buckley and Gary Wills and all these people that um, were the kind of mainstays of political journalism in the 70s. And so that was, I read, that was a lot of what I read. And then a lot of kind of World War II history. Was very deeply fascinated by World War II because my father had grown up as a kid outside of London during the war, had memories of the war, so it was real for me. I mean, he would tell me stories of lying in his bed and hearing the German bombers go overhead. And so, like, that idea that your dad was somehow trapped in the middle of a war when he was your age uh, was pretty fascinating to me.
With all the stuff you read about the US politics, can you believe where we got to?
Well, actually, I can believe it's made me. I have. I've been immersed in American politics, since I was a pre-teenager, and so I'm not surprised by anything. I'm not convinced that the situation we're in now is any more dire than it was in, you know, 63, 64, or 68. Uh, America would have seemed like it was in. I mean, there were people. I mean, it was a legitimate fear whether the country would survive. So I think we've been in much worse places than we are now.
It's just amplified by everyone having a voice now on social media.
Yeah, yeah. We can hear the crackpots now.
After high school, you attended Trinity College in Toronto to study history. Did you enjoy your time there? Also, did you become a Maple Leafs fan? I'm on a big NHL kick.
I did not become a Leafs fan. I have no interest in hockey, which makes me a very bad Canadian. Um, I don't know why. I never. When I came to Canada, I sort of felt like I had missed the boat on. I was 6. Everyone I knew already was skating and already playing. Every single boy in my first grade class was on a hockey team. Every single one, except for me. And I decided, what's the point? Like, these guys have got a big head start. So I never really learned to skate. I was a very so not a Leafs fan. I was a Blue Jays fan until I could no longer handle the heart. But baseball is a uniquely heartbreaking sport in my experience. And finally, the emotional toll of being a Blue Jays fan grew too great. And then they won those 2 World Series, and I decided I'm going to quit while I'm ahead. And so I stopped. And then I'm a Buffalo Bills fan. That's my concession to that, because that's the closest NFL team. But I actually had a wonderful time. My college experience, now what's funny about it is that I hear today about how, the enormous mental health problems of kids on college campuses, the turmoil, you know, all this kind of stuff that's going on there. None of that was happening when I was in college. We just enjoyed ourselves. It was so super low stakes. I didn't feel like there was any pressure. Nobody was going. It was Canada. Our tuition was less than $1,000 a year. Uh, we I played a lot of touch football. I, you know, I went to a lot of parties. I read a lot of books. Had a lot of discussions late into the night. I wrote a lot of bad essays. It was a really, really totally fun experience, and I don't think I had a moment of anxiety or regret or um, uh, any of the things that seem so much a part of the contemporary college experience. I don't know what happened. I don't know how college went from something that was supposed to be a really, really fun escape from your parents' house to something that was a kind of uh, opportunity for worry and distress, which it seems to be now. I don't know how that transition happened, but it's a heartbreaking transition.
It's probably that something to do with the tuition price and debt, right? The amount of loans you have to
Yeah, a
take to
lot of,
go.
I can't, no one I knew had any anxiety about the cost of college because the cost was so low, so heavily subsidized. And then there were all these essentially no interest government loans that were available. And if you remove that from the table, um, maybe college is you can concentrate on what matters at college, which is growing up, which is what college is just about growing up, right? And that was what was on our mind, figuring out what it meant to be an adult. Figuring out how to talk to girls, figuring out how to drink, which it's super, you know, when I look back on what I learned in college, one of the most important things was what is alcohol, right? What is its function in your life? Um, and in your first year, I remember there was a occasion when I drank too much and I was sick for 3 days, and I realized, oh, that's a really stupid way to interact with alcohol. And I've never gotten massively drunk again. I mean, I learned, and so did all my peers. We all like figured it out, right? That's sort of um, a small example of the kind of thing I think it's useful to learn. And it's a safe place to screw up and learn what you can and can't do.
Is the culture in Canadian college, is it similar to the US where it's very high strung now, or is it still a lesser version of that?
I don't know what the culture in Canadian colleges is like at the moment. I mean, I haven't lived there in many years. I still think it's a little less stressed out because the most prestigious American school, Harvard, has got 8,000 undergraduates. The most prestigious Canadian school, University of Toronto, has 70,000 undergraduates. And Canada
Wow.
is a country that's 1/10 the size.
Yeah.
So Canada is 1/10 the size, and our most prestigious school is 10 times as many slots. So the competition to get into an elite school in Canada is very different
Yeah.
than it is here. So that's something to think about.
When you graduated college, you applied to a bunch of ad agencies. What led you to that?
Well, I didn't really know what I was going to do with my life, and then I thought advertising was sounded like fun. I had no experience. I didn't have any better ideas about what I was going to do. I had a vague idea that I might go to law school. Uh, so I just applied. I just out of lark, I just applied to a bunch of them. Didn't get a single job. I went 0 for 15 or 0 for 21. I've forgotten what the number was that I applied to. But but I had I had this idea that the idea of telling a story in 30 seconds struck me as being incredibly interesting, and it still does. I still have enormous respect for people in advertising that who can do that. Um, and yeah, that was my first abortive attempt to find a career.
At that point, did you know that you were, a talented writer? You mentioned you wrote a couple essays in undergrad.
I was writing for our school newspaper, but just as a joke. We had a serious school newspaper, and then we had a joke school newspaper, and I wrote for the joke one. And we just made up stuff. And I had a little magazine I did with friends called Ad Hominem, and it was like a newsletter. And we used to photocopy copies and send them out to friends. Um, so I was doing writing of a sort, but I didn't think that didn't strike me as something you could do for a living. I didn't understand how that worked. Um, so I kind of when I ended up in journalism a couple years later, it was entirely by chance.
You first got hired at the American Spectator, a conservative newspaper in Indiana. I was surprised reading that. How did that come to be?
I did. That was my first job, which I applied to. Someone just showed me an ad in the back of the magazine, which I knew nothing about it, never read it. Applied, got the job. Lasted about 5 months before I was fired. Had a blast. It was in Bloomington, Indiana. It was founded by people who were graduates of Indiana University. Um, uh, uh, and uh, and then I moved to Washington D.C. and kind of bummed around for a couple years before landing a job with the Washington Post. So it was a kind of there was nothing planned about it. And when I moved to Washington, the only way I knew how to make a living was I decided I got a job at some random Washington think tank, but I was freelancing on the side, just writing articles for anyone who would take them. And that's how I kind of got inside the world of journalism. But it was a great time. The mid '80s were a great time to be in Washington D.C. It was just a town, still is a town with enormous numbers of opportunities for young people. And I remember feeling then that this was a big difference between Canada and the US was if you were in DC and you were 25, people could take you seriously. Because you think about it, DC runs on people, every congressional office is staffed overwhelmingly by people in their 20s and they make substantive decisions. It's not unusual for a senior aide to a congressman or a senator to be in their 20s. Uh, it's tons and tons and tons of jobs at like think tanks and places are staffed by people in their 20s. It's a town that runs on young people. And it was, again, it's just sheer accident I went there, but it was an incredibly lucky break that as a young person, I went to a town that took young people seriously.
What happened that got you fired at the Indiana one?
Oh, I think I just I had difficulty getting up in the morning. I think it was just I just wasn't taking it seriously. I don't think it was that. I was only 20, so I didn't
Got it.
really. I was way too young for the workplace at that point. So I think I was just irresponsible.
And then when you were in DC, when you were doing the freelancing on the side, was it intentional with the thought of improving your writing and building up your portfolio to get to somewhere like the Washington Post, or was it just for fun and
No,
make a couple extra
just
bucks?
I never had a plan. I just was like doing. I thought it would be fun. There's stuff I wanted to write about. I had a roommate who helped me, who was in that world of magazine writing and helped me hook me up with people and contacts. And I just thought it was I really wanted. I need to make money. I didn't. Because I was making I think I was making $13,000 a year or something. So I could barely make rent. So I was trying to find a way to augment my income, and it was either that or working at McDonald's. And I figured maybe there was easier money writing articles. So that's what I did. That was my initial motivation.
Was there anything you wrote during that time that inspired you or made you, got you really excited, or was it just truly to make a couple bucks?
I remember recently met a guy who was a fertility doctor in Manhattan, a very prominent one. I was chatting with him, and he said, "You're the guy who wrote and he produced the very first article I wrote as a freelancer in Washington D.C. was in like 1986 or 7 for the New Republic, and it was about all the legal issues surrounding IVF. And this guy had found this article, and he was writing something about it, and he was like referencing this article I'd written back in '87. I'd totally forgotten I wrote this, but apparently that was my first article. I wrote it with somebody. My tactic back then, because I had no experience, particular skill, contacts is I would always write things with people. So I would befriend someone who knew something about a subject, and I would say, "Hey, you want to write this thing together?" And I would do the reporting, and then they would do everything else. And that worked really well. So I wrote it with someone who knew a lot about. I had this idea to write about IVF, and I found a woman who'd written a book about it. And I said, "Let's do this article together." And she said yes, incredibly. And so that was my first byline. Um, it's funny.
So you spent 10 years at the Washington Post and then went to the New Yorker in 1996, where you have remained to this day, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I did. I was at the Washington Post, and then I went and became the Washington Post New York bureau, and then I jumped from there. I wanted to write longer things. I started writing on the side for the New Yorker, and they finally offered me a job, and I moved to the New Yorker in 1996 because I wanted to write. I thought the idea of writing, you know, 8,000-word articles was more fun than writing short little newspaper stories. And I was there at the New Yorker during the kind of uh, a really remarkable period in its history, and and wrote about everything under the sun for my first 10 years. It was really that's where I came up with the idea for the tipping point. It's where um, all my early books grew out of reporting I had done for the writing I'd done for the New Yorker. It was where I kind of learned how to write. I think had incredible editors there, and it was an amazing experience. I don't really write much for the New Yorker anymore. I'm now consumed with my podcast, but um, it was I really spent my 20s at the Washington Post and my 30s and early 40s at the New Yorker, and that's where I really kind of came of age as a writer.
Malcolm, when you were at the New Yorker, you said that you had really good editors. Is that where you started to feel like you had some talent in it, or was it still just paying the rent?
No, I began to realize that I never thought about it in terms of having talent. It was really a question of what my level of enjoyment was. I realized I'd found something that I love doing. Um, as long as you love doing something, I think that's the thing that drives your performance more than anything. And I just had so much fun. I was reading a piece I wrote. I wrote a piece. Remember on late night TV? You won't, Troy, but Tim, you will. In the '90s, on late night TV, there was a guy named Ron Popeil who used to run infomercials for various kitchen gadgets like the Showtime rotisserie oven and all these things. And I had forgotten this. I wrote this long profile of Ron Popeil and the whole kitchen gadget world in like the '90s. I wrote this in the late '90s for the New Yorker, and I reread it recently, and it was like it brought back all these memories. I hung out with this crazy kitchen gadget inventor in LA for like a week, and then I talked. He was from the Jersey boardwalk from the South Jersey, and I went out to South Jersey and met all these members of his family, and I talked to all these people about his dad, who was a famous kitchen gadget inventor. It was just like where else in the world are you going to have a job that allows you to wander America interviewing people about kitchen gadgets? And it was just fun. It was like I had a blast. It was like and it was a job. I like jobs where they give you a lot of autonomy, and I was given a lot of autonomy when I was at the New Yorker.
Then you write an article called The Tipping Point, which you used as the basis for your first book, The Tipping Point: How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference. You earn $1 million advance, and the rest is history, as they say. Now, was the book your idea?
Yeah, I had written an article for the New Yorker called The Tipping Point, which was just all about I was living in New York and I had seen crime just go away. Not go away entirely, but like crime dropped between 93 and 97 by some astronomical amount in New York. And I just was so blown away by this. I wanted to try and understand how it happened. And so I wrote a little piece for the New Yorker called The Tipping Point, which was just about applying. My idea was that the only way to understand why crime would have fallen so far and so fast was to use the metaphor of the epidemic, that it was behaving like an infectious disease. It was going away the way that the flu goes away every spring. Um, and that was the thesis of this article I wrote. And it attracted a lot of attention, and I got a book deal. And so I just expanded that into a book. Um, so it was that was my first book. I had zero expectations for it. I didn't realize it was going to be the success that it was, but it really did change. It started me on the path I'm on now, which is very much someone who, I've written, I think, 7 books since then. So it kind of defined what the trajectory of my career was going to be. And it made me realize that I could write. Until you write a book, you're just unsure. You would notice, Tim. Until you write one, you have no idea whether you're capable of writing one, right? It seems like it's just different from any other task you've ever done. And you're asking so much of your reader that they stay with you for days, right? I mean, it's a crazy commitment that you're asking of your reader. And so I think anyone who hasn't written a book has legitimate doubts about whether they can ask for that commitment from their readers. And I did not know whether I could ask, and I figured out that I actually could, and it would work. So that was it was a hugely significant moment in my life.
So when the article comes out, it was obviously very popular. And then did someone just reach out to you and say, "Hey, let's turn this into a book"?
Yeah, I had a friend, someone I knew socially, who had become a book agent, and she just said, "You should write a book about this." It was as simple as that. It wasn't my idea. It was her idea to turn it into a book. Um, uh, so that's just what we did. It was I don't really, it's so funny. It's been 25 years. I have very dim memories of how it happened, but she just said, she told me, "You should write a proposal." I'd never written a book proposal. So I was like, "Oh, all right." I just kind of sat down and banged something out, um, yeah, and got a lot of interest among publishers.
I listened to a lot of Malcolm Gladwell in preparation for this talk. I made a note that I wanted to follow up with you about something. Oh, first, I have to tell you that I love your narrative voice. It's calming, almost soporific. My random question is this: why do you have beef with Ivy League schools? And why do you discourage kids from going to their dream school if they get accepted?
Well, I forget where you went to school, Tim. So I can't remember
We
whether I'm
we
insulting
both
you
went
or
to
not.
Syracuse. No, you're good.
Oh, Syracuse. All right. I got no beef with Syracuse. My cousin went to Syracuse. Uh, the By the way, Troy, when did you graduate from Syracuse?
I
Troy?
graduated from Syracuse in 2016, and then I did Syracuse Law School until 2019.
Oh, all right. You didn't know a guy named Stephen Muir, did you?
I'll have to look. I'm
He-
better with faces
That's
than
my
names.
cousin.
It's
He went
possible.
to Syracuse at exactly that time. He was in the architecture school. Anyway,
Oh, that's
um,
so funny.
the well, I don't have my beef with Ivy League schools is just that they have um, these absurdly large endowments that I don't feel are justified. That there are there that it's I find I have a moral problem with a school like Harvard, which has only gotten 8,000 undergraduates, having $55 billion in the bank, um, when other schools that are serving a much more deserving population have no money in the bank. That strikes me as weird. Um, I suppose I don't have a problem with. I understand why the school would want to have as much money as possible in the bank. I don't understand why people would give them money. I suppose that's a better way of explaining my issue. If you're going to give money to a school, give it to a school that needs it. And yet, lots and lots and lots of wealthy people continue to give money to schools that don't need their money, which is a paradox that I cannot resolve. Um, Students, my perspective on students is that I think people, particularly in STEM, and there's a lot of research to back this up, there are incredibly high dropout rates in STEM. And if you look at who drops out of STEM programs, it's students who are in the bottom half of their class. It's really hard to be in the bottom half of your class. So if you want to take STEM, don't go to a school where you're going to be in the bottom half of your class, right? That's the simple rule. Go to a place where you'll be in the top half. It is hard enough to get a STEM degree without having to deal with the crushing psychological burden of being in a classroom where most other people are ahead of you. It's just really hard. You're doing organic chemistry and you feel like you're the dumbest person in the class. You are not going to finish that course. And if you don't finish organic chemistry, you can kiss med school goodbye, right? So go to a school where you're not in the bottom of your class. That's the advice. Now, of course, not everyone can do this, um, but it is a kind of useful way to decide what school is appropriate for you. And I think that young people are obsessed with going to the best possible school. And what they really should be obsessed with is going to the most appropriate school, the school that fits you and your abilities and your interests. Fit is what matters, right? Um, and I think that if we talk in terms of fit, then we will solve a lot of the problems that are associated with higher ed for students, particularly students who are feeling overwhelmed. And I mean, if you want to get a physics degree and you go to a school and you end up dropping out and getting a degree that doesn't have nearly the same marketplace value, you were wasting your time in college, and you're denying yourself an opportunity to spend the rest of your life in a career that you might have loved. Why would you do that? It just seems nuts to me. Just go to a school where you can finish, right? This is like, it's crazy. I remember I had a girlfriend in college who went to it was an elite magnet school in Toronto called University of Toronto Schools, where all the smartest kids in Toronto went. It was like an exam school to get into. Incredibly, unbelievably high-powered school. And I had a girlfriend who went to UTS, as it was called, and she was brilliant. But at UTS, she was in the bottom half of her class, and she was convinced she was not smart. And I would say to her, "You're brilliant. You're in the 99th percentile of humanity. But because you went to this crazy school, which was the smartest kids in basically Canada, you think you're not smart." Well, of course, like in her math class, if there were 25 people in her algebra class, 24 of them were going to go on to take math at some major world-class elite university. She was the 25th. Of course she felt like an idiot, right? They're all going to MIT, right? Well, what do you expect to happen? So, it's very hard to understand that we make judgments about ourselves based on our relative position in a hierarchy, not on our absolute position in a hierarchy. This happens in sports, by the way, all the time, is like the seventh man on the Boston Celtics, Peyton Pritchard, thinks that he is a second-tier basketball player. He would start for nearly any other team in the league. So he carries around this feeling that, I'm not as good as I should come out. I'm probably only good for 20 minutes a game. There are 20 teams in the NBA that if he played for, he would be playing 35 minutes a game and would think of himself as a bona fide star and would be like, it's just a question of where he is. If you play with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown and Porzingis all day long, you don't think you're tier one. But if he was a Pelican, he thinks he's Michael Jordan, right? It's a really important principle to keep in mind.
There's this basketball player. He's retired now, and everyone used to always rag on him. I can't remember his first name. I think it's Brian Scalabrine. Do you remember him as a basketball player?
Scalabrine.
Yeah, so he goes around now because everyone fans used to just kill him. And he says, "I'm closer to LeBron than you are to me." And he'll play one-on-one against fans in random gyms and just kill everybody.
That's right. He does YouTube. That's right. Where he kills people. Yeah, it's hilarious. Yeah. Well, there's a separate thing here, which is fans as a rule, even though they are fans and really are into the sports they're into, they underestimate how much better at sports pro athletes are than they realize. Right? Yeah. Like you kind of think that like I'm a runner and casual runners such as myself, we think, the people in the Olympics are like one tier up from me. They're not one tier up from me. They're like 7 tiers up from me. They do more in their sleep than I do when I'm full out. Like, it's just like, there's a cavernous gap between the most of us and elite athletes, and that gap is getting uh, bigger and bigger and bigger all the time.
Yeah, I agree. This is not my idea. I heard somebody else say it. I wish it was my idea. They should have an average Joe like do the Olympics, like have the pool, fill all the lanes, then add a lane on the side and just have an average person swim. Fill the track,
Yeah,
have an average person run. Like it would be so comical. And just as like a relative point, like, okay, that's about where I'd be as they're
I have a
getting
friend
lapped.
who was swam for Stanford and did not make the U.S. Olympic team, although she was close. She's now my age. She's 61. If you watch her swim in a pool, it does not resemble swimming. It resembles some weird alien activity that you've never seen before that is twice as fast as you've ever seen it. She doesn't swim on a regular basis. She just jumps in the pool and she's doing something you're like, oh, she's like an order of magnitude better than anyone else I've ever seen. She wasn't even world. I mean, she was on the fringes of world class. She wasn't even in the top run, and she's like mind blowing.
Yeah, it always happens.
You identified yourself as a Christian when you were growing up, but you lost your way. Then you were found. I too was lost, and then I was diagnosed with ALS, and I viewed it as God giving me a second chance. So I repented, and I recommitted myself to Jesus Christ. Can you tell the readers about Wilma Dirksen and the impact that it made on your spiritual journey?
Oh, it's funny. In my book, David and Goliath, I devoted a chapter to the extraordinary story of a Canadian woman, a Mennonite, whose daughter was young daughter was murdered, and who decided to forgive her daughter's assailant. Um, and Forgiveness is a very, very important. Taking the Christian notion of forgiveness seriously is a very important component of the Mennonite faith, and what, to my mind, one of the most attractive components of that. And understanding its implications, and and trying to make it real in the world as opposed to simply um, thinking of it as an abstract notion. And it, to my mind, the idea, if you're a for someone to forgive their daughter's murderer, the only way I think a human being is capable of doing that, which is, to my mind, I cannot think of a more impossible uh, task, right, that the world could give us than to forgive one of our children's murderers. I think that's, to my mind, that is proof of the existence of God. It's the That is only possible with the power of faith. Uh, I don't think you can do it otherwise. It's not something you can do on your own, and it's such an extraordinary, difficult feat that you need help. Um, so yeah, writing about her really did kind of rekindle a lot of um, my faith in God and my interest and my understanding of the importance of uh, of our relationship to Jesus.
You did a TED Talk where you apologized for the first part of the tipping point. Was that your idea? I thought the woman who questioned you was abrasive at best.
Uh, it was my idea. I don't have any, uh, I've never had a problem with admitting when I was wrong. I think that's a normal. If you're a writer who deals with ideas and has been around for a while, you're going to be wrong on some portion of the time. And the easiest thing to do is just to say I was wrong, and then here's here's what I think now. Right? I don't think there's any shame in getting something wrong the first time. And so that was my idea to do that TED talk. Trying to remember the woman who questioned me. She didn't seem abrasive. I think she was just that was just her style. I she was. I thought of that as a um, what's the right way to say it? I mean, I think I was I was entering into some pretty uh, uh, complicated terrain, and I think she was up for the journey, and she was so that's what that exchange was about.
You're very private about your family. I have only seen your wife in a picture flashed on the screen for no more than a second on some CBS News show. She's very pretty, by the way. Anyway, I say this because if you choose to pass on my next question, the listeners will understand the context. I like to try to ask our guests at the end of each podcast to brag about their family, especially their kids, because it's our magnum opus.
Oh, I'm happy to. My, my, I have two little ones, preschoolers, two girls. Uh, they are, one resembles my mother, in a way that cracks me up every time I look at her. Um, and the other one is all I care about is that one of them be a good runner. That's all I care about. I mean, I care about other things, but like I can tell that's going to matter a lot to me. So I'm constantly scrutinizing them to see evidence. They're 3.5 and 1.5 to see evidence of running ability, and I there's some early indications that I may have a winner in the little one. She is the big one is too busy litigating every single issue to death with her mother. I think that's going to prove a distraction when it comes to running. The little one is super focused. And I was like, oh, there's my athlete. She 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 is looking straight ahead on the move, solving problems. That's the one I want. So I have
my
moved all my expectations to my little one.
my first is a girl, and she's like every single thing is a debate, and she's got the reason why. And my second one is it appears to be, they're still so young, but appears to be the athlete too. So we'll
Yeah,
have
yeah,
to
yeah.
follow up
It's
in 10
funny.
years.
You can't start early enough with your paternal expectations.
That's right. That's right. Malcolm, really quick before we go to this, the last segment here, I got to say, my dad, my whole life always said to me, he's like, because my dad was a first round NFL draft pick, and he's all, his laundry list of accomplishments. And he's always like, yeah, you got to get lucky. I'm like, dude, get out of here, get lucky. You were 6'3", 250 pounds. You ran a force, like you could run fast. Like it's not luck. Like this was hard work, and this was all. And I was telling you a little bit before we started recording, I was on my honeymoon with my wife, and I was reading Outliers, and something about it just like grabbed me. I couldn't put it down, and all the stuff. It was like you had heard my 15 years of arguing with my dad about luck and not
Oh,
needing luck and situation, and you kind of
anytime
had
I can
it.
help you win an argument, Troy, I'm delighted.
Yeah. And it was just all the situations that come into it. Him being bigger when he's younger, and he has a Hall of Fame college coach at his high school, like all these, this just perfect recipe for
Mhm.
him, right, and his success. So it was really cool. Anyways, huge fan of that book.
Now on to our final word segment, where we ask our guests a few rapid fire questions. What was the happiest moment in your life?
I think when my daughter when my first child was born.
What are you most excited about?
Two things: seeing my kids grow up, and be the prospect of a Buffalo Bills Super Bowl victory, which I feel is imminent.
And a third, seeing the first track meet, right?
Yes.
The next one, what advice would you give your younger self?
I should have left the United States. I should have gone somewhere in my 20s. It would have broadened my horizons. I should have lived in another part of the world.
Second to last one here, and this one should be a layup for you. We ask everybody, but do you have any good book recommendations for us or for the listeners?
I'm obsessed with a book called Taking Back the Game by Linda Flanagan, which is this whole thing about youth sports, particularly girls' sports, and what's gone wrong with them, and how we can restore joy. She thinks people took the joy out of youth sports, and she wants to bring it back. And she's incredibly interesting practical ideas about how to do that. And that's something that I think is, I don't think you can restore the mental health of young people until you start to fix the institutions that they're a part of. And I think something's gone badly wrong with youth sports, and we've drained it of the fun, and we got to put fun back in.
That's really interesting. I'm going to order that one. Last question we ask every guest. The name of our podcast is Nothing Left Unsaid. Do you have anything that you want to say?
No, just that I've enjoyed this. It's good to see you again, Tim, after so many years. And no, this has been a fun conversation. I hope it's not another 15 years before we talk again. And by the way, for the record, I did not trounce you in that debate. As I recall, you held your own, more than held your own. I didn't remember. I thought you won the debate. I don't remember winning that debate. I thought we lost it. So you're being unduly modest. I'm not accepting
I went back and watched it before this, and you guys actually did when it was close. But Malcolm, you guys won. You guys won your side. So
well, all right, that was it was probably in the most kind of liberal anti-football enclave of New York City. So we stacked it.
It was NYU was a pretty it's a pretty good place.
We don't even have a football team, so that should tell you something.
Malcolm, my last question here, and we'll let you go, is we ask every guest at the end of the podcast, is there anybody you know personally that you think we should try to get on the podcast?
You should have that woman I mentioned, Linda Flanagan. If you, I can send you her email. She's great and so interesting about sports. I can't even tell you.
Yeah,
that's you perfect. Should totally have her on your show.
Perfect.
Email me and I'll give you her email address.
I will. I'll follow up with you. Malcolm, really appreciate you coming on. And like I said, not just blowing smoke. You are probably outside of my dad, my favorite author. So I appreciate you coming on. Really cool hearing your voice. Listen to the podcast too. So there were a couple of times when you were talking, I started dozing off. I'm like, oh crap, I have to respond. I have to engage in this one. It's not a one way. So thanks so much for coming on. It's really cool.
Malcolm Gladwell, it has been such a pleasure to catch up with you. You are so gracious to do this. I thank you again. And may God continue to bless you and your family.
Thank you, guys.
If you enjoyed today's episode, consider supporting the podcast for free by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform, leaving a review, and sharing it with your friends. Your support means the world to us. This episode of Nothing Left Unsaid is brought to you by 11 Labs. Their groundbreaking technology makes a huge difference, and we're grateful for their support. To learn more, visit 11labs.io. A substantial portion of our sponsorship proceeds go to tackleals.com, funding cutting-edge ALS research. If you'd like to join the fight and contribute, visit tackleals.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Nothing Left Unsaid.